Into the Labyrinth. When I first started drafting this personal narrative series, this episode wasn't part of the plan. But apparently the Labyrinth had other plans for me. As I was working on other parts of this series, I kept having dreams that brought the image and its characters back to my attention, showing me that not only can I not ignore it, but really, the only way I can start this entire journey is by entering the labyrinth first. I'm going to tell a version of a myth whose earliest traceable forms comes from ancient Crete. The story continued into what became the Greek and Roman empires and spread throughout the history and reach of Western colonialism. The story itself has not only endured, but the images and themes in it have repeatedly inspired art, literature, and popular entertainment. But I do want to point out some different ways the images and characters associated with this mythical structure relate to deeper themes that have spoken to me at different times in my life and have clearly resonated and inspired other people too. I feel like the topic of the labyrinth is in itself a labyrinth, one that I can repeatedly go back to and get lost in. But, unlike the so-called hero of the story, I'm less interested in solving the puzzle or defeating the monster than I am in exploring the maze itself. Every time I come back to this story, I discover something new about myself, my perceptions, and my relationships. To me, there is no end, but that's never the goal. With a story so rich, I imagine that different people in different time periods may never run out of things to say about it, and each interpretation or reflection opens its own new world for contemplation. It's a story that's easy to get lost in, if you can imagine, with all the twists and turns, and my telling of it is going to be no different. And whatever you think is at the center of this labyrinth, I probably won't reach it. If anything, it might seem like I'm only getting further and further away. But I hope you will stay with me for at least part of this spiraling journey. Chapter 1. The Story. It would be hard, probably impossible, to pinpoint a specific time or place as the origin of the image of a labyrinth. Spiral patterns appear in human artwork starting in the Paleolithic or Stone Age, as early as 30,000 BCE. These figures evolved in different places around the world that would have likely had no connection to each other. Now, in the English language, there's a distinction between a maze, which has several different possible paths and includes dead ends, and a labyrinth, which only has one twisting and turning path to a center point and then back out again. The earliest depictions of labyrinth are called classical and date back to at least 2000 BCE. They are constructed from a central base or seed pattern, and variations of them have been found across Europe, North Africa, India, Indonesia, and North America. Perhaps the most famous story known today involving a labyrinth, and where the name itself comes from, has its origin on the island of Crete, possibly more than 3,000 years ago. The story must have endured through oral tradition before its characters were mentioned in the Homeric epics, and most of the versions I've encountered follow the details given by the Roman poet Ovid in his collection The Metamorphoses, written around 8 years into the Common Era. This version of the story starts in the ancient mythical past, in a land called Phoenicia, which is in modern-day Lebanon, with a woman who would become the mother of a king and the namesake of a continent. Her name is Europa. She was an innocent young princess with a cruel and tyrannical father. One day, as she was playing outside with her similarly innocent maiden companions, a majestic white bull joined them. There's a long description about how gentle and beautiful the bull is, how he lets the maidens get close to him and decorate him with flower garlands, and when Europa finally is bold enough to climb on his back, the bull swims off into the ocean with her in tow. Unbeknownst to her, the white bull is actually the god Zeus, because this was something that he liked to do, appear as an animal or in some other magical form to seduce mortal women. The next thing you know, Europa arrives on the island of Crete, pregnant. She marries the king Asterion, gives birth to Minos, the son of Zeus, and over time she and the human king have other children as well. After Minos comes of age, he wants confirmation from the gods that he has the right to be the next king. So Minos prays for a sign, and Poseidon, the god of the sea, sends him a white bull that emerges right out of the water. But the stipulation is that Minos is supposed to sacrifice the bull upon his victory. So after King Minos is victorious, what doesn't he do? He doesn't make the sacrifice. Maybe he was so confident and arrogant that he thought he didn't need to repay the gods. Maybe he was thinking of his own divine paternity, and he couldn't bring himself to kill a bull that reminded him of his father. Whatever the reason, Minos doesn't hold up his end of the bargain. So Poseidon recruits Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and together they come up with a curse. Of course, they don't put it on King Minos. That would be too straightforward. They put the curse on his wife, Queen Pasiphae, making her fall erotically in love with the beautiful white bull. The queen is inflamed with desire and has only one thing on her mind. She secretly asks for help from the palace architect, Daedalus, who has been living in Crete after being exiled from Athens. This puts Daedalus in a precarious position. His allegiance is to the king, yet he probably suspects the gods have a hand in the queen's situation, and he can't refuse his part in the greater plan. So he constructs a wooden cow for the queen to climb inside and consummate this cursed relationship. The plan works. Pasiphae becomes pregnant, and the result is a monstrous baby, half human and half bull, which we know in mythology is the Minotaur. King Minos finds out and isn't pleased. Ovid speaks of the king's disgrace, though it doesn't seem that Minos has enough reflective capacity to recognize himself as the source of these problems. Instead, he tries to hide his shame and keep everything a secret. He goes to Daedalus, the master craftsman who never seems to run out of work, and commissions Daedalus to build a labyrinth to hide the Minotaur inside. In this version of the story, the labyrinth is described as a convoluted maze with multiple paths, full of winding turns and dead ends. As Daedalus constructs it, he himself has trouble getting out and almost gets lost inside after it's finished. Meanwhile, King Minos has been having other problems with the city of Athens on the mainland, with whom he has been in conflict since he sent his son there to compete in a series of athletic games, and the young prince ended up getting killed in a bull-related incident. As a result, Minos wages war against Athens. They get an oracle involved, and the oracle tells Athens that they must submit to Crete. As part of their tribute, every cycle of the great year, Athens has to send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete to compete in a series of games and eventually be sacrificed to the Minotaur in the labyrinth. It's during one of these cycles that Theseus, a young man in Athens with his own convoluted backstory, who has recently found out that he's a prince, volunteers to be part of the sacrifice. So Theseus ends up in Crete, competes in the games, and meets King Minos' daughter, Ariadne, who falls in love with him. In order to help Theseus survive the labyrinth, Ariadne consults who else but Daedalus, and he tells her a trick. Theseus must bring a spool of thread with him into the labyrinth and tie one end of the thread to the entrance and unwind the rest as he goes further in, and then follow the thread to retrace his steps back to the beginning without getting lost. Ariadne also gives Theseus a sword he sneaks in under his clothes. Luckily for him, Theseus is able to make it to the center of the labyrinth, defeat the monster, find his way out, and escape the island with the princess, because they know King Minos is really going to be mad about this. There are different accounts and different traditions about what happens next. After they land on the island of Naxos to rest, Theseus either falls asleep and wakes up and forgets about Ariadne, or falls out of love with her because of some other intervention from the gods. Whatever the case, Ariadne is abandoned, while Theseus continues on to Athens. Not that this story ends well for Theseus. He can't escape tragedy, either when he arrives home or in the continuing adventures and misadventures of his life after he becomes king. Heroes in these stories seldom have happy endings, and it's questionable whether these characters were ever intended to be role models for regular people. I want to move on from Theseus, though, because aside from the typical hero, princess, tyrant, and monster setup, this story has another focal point: Daedalus, the craftsman, who has his own saga. Before arriving in Crete and working as the royal architect for King Minos, Daedalus lived in Athens. As he was in the early stages of developing his career and reputation, his sister sent her 12-year-old son to be his apprentice. Now, the boy, who is named either Talos or Perdix, was very gifted. There's a story about how he and Daedalus were walking along the beach, and Perdix saw a fish skeleton, which inspired him to invent the saw, with a serrated edge mimicking the fish spine. Daedalus became envious of his nephew's skill, and feared the boy would soon outshine him. So, he did what I assume any reasonable person would do, which was take his nephew up to the top of the Temple of Minerva and push him off. I guess there was just no other way. In some accounts, the young boy falls to his death, or in Ovid, the goddess Minerva herself witnesses the crime and turns the boy into a partridge so he can fly away. Daedalus's crime is discovered, and he gets exiled from Athens, causing him to flee to Crete and seek refuge in the service of King Minos. Then comes the whole situation with the bull, the queen, and the labyrinth. After Theseus defeats the monster and escapes with Ariadne, King Minos is still worried his secrets are going to be found out, so he imprisons both Daedalus and his son Icarus to make sure they can't reveal anything. In some accounts, Daedalus and Icarus are held captive in the labyrinth, but in a lot of stories and artistic depictions, they are isolated in a tower. Either way, they're trapped and can't leave the island. Daedalus does what he always does and gets to work, and I don't know how they did this or where they found them, but he and his son managed to collect bird feathers and get their hands on some string and wax, and from these, Daedalus constructs wings for himself and Icarus. Now we are getting to another part of the story a lot of people are familiar with. As Daedalus and Icarus are preparing to take flight from the tower, Daedalus warns Icarus not to fly too low because he will get close to the waves and his wings will get wet, but not to fly too high either, because then he will get too close to the sun and the wax will melt. They set off into the open air. Icarus flies behind his father, who's keeping the middle path. But the boy is so caught up in exhilaration and recklessness that he just throws all his cares to the wind and ignores his father's advice. He flies higher and higher, and as he gets closer to the sun, the inevitable happens. The wax melts, and before he can realize what is happening, he has bare arms instead of wings, and he plummets into the sea and drowns. Daedalus is able to recover the body of his dead son, and he buries him on the island which he names Icaria after him. According to Ovid, a partridge watches over the burial. The story doesn't stop there, of course. Daedalus is still fleeing persecution and must continue on. But this seems like a good break for me to pause the tale here, to include some of my own thoughts and research into the myth and its history.